Have you ever thought that the world is going mad? That it's lurching from crisis to crisis? That common sense and rationality seem to have vanished? Is the world out of control? Or is it perhaps under the control of people we cannot control? What's really going on? For those who want to look behind the headlines and hear the questions asked which no one dares ask, this is the Laughland Report.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Laughland Report. It's an absolute delight to welcome Ralf Dekker. Ralf Dekker is the youngest Member of Parliament for FVD, youngest in terms of months of service. You replaced Simone Kersenboom a few months ago, but you're not the youngest in terms of years. You are a grand old man. No, you're not an old man, but you're a grand man among a bunch of teenage rebels, if I may say so. How have you enjoyed it? What are your first experiences of being in Parliament?
Well, it's exactly what you say. It's very it's amusing to be an old guy in the midst of true youngsters there.
Yeah.
And it's not just our party, but basically it's the entire Parliament. Because also when people try to interrupt me in speeches, I get a bit of a fatherly feeling because almost all of them is one generation younger than I am, which places you in a bit of a special position. So I must say I like it. It's in terms of the energy, the dynamism. It's a dynamic environment. And it's one of the few environments where someone like me with, I have 65 years on the clock, is being taken, sort of seriously by the other generation, which is something you should treasure, I think.
Yeah. And what's your impression of the level of debate? I mean, obviously you will have watched debates before you entered the chamber, before you became a Member of Parliament. But what's your impression of how the lower chamber functions? I ask that as a British national because it's very different from the House of Commons. It's extremely polite. It's very quiet, isn't it? The Dutch Parliament, the House of Commons is
the House of Commons. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, but it's. I must say, I was a bit disappointed by the level, let's say the intellectual level of the conversations of the debates. Because I was looking forward to giving some important speeches.
Yeah.
So I have given a speech on the pension system, on the foreign affairs, on the education system. Some big speeches that you can nicely prepare, and then basically it's very simple because you read them.
Yes.
I haven't yet reached the stage where I simply go there and speak just like that. I think. The English are very strong in that because when you look at Farage, for instance, at the time, I was always impressed by his way of giving a complete speech without a second looking at the paper.
Yeah.
In our parliament, it's almost everyone simply reads from something that. So I decided not to try and overdo it and simply print out the speech. And then, unfortunately, I'm in need of reading glasses.
Right.
So even when I have it in huge letters, it doesn't really work. So
And you've concentrated then, you mentioned pensions, but you've concentrated, I think, quite a lot on foreign policy, which I'm certainly interested in. You gave a very interesting speech, which I read before you gave it.
We even discussed it.
And we discussed it. And you made a number of really very important points. You looked back with a certain nostalgia to the 1950s, you said, or at least to, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago when diplomacy was not what it is now. And but one point you made that I really liked, I mean, there were many, but one of them was you said that say a generation ago, the only government ministry that dealt with international matters was the foreign ministry. The debate was about the foreign minister, whereas now everything is international, everything, whether it's agriculture, the economy, energy policy, whatever.
Yeah. Well, that's a huge difference. And what I was trying to say there to the Minister of Foreign Affairs was that when this very building, because the building where the Parliament is placed today, is the building that is specifically built for foreign affairs at the time in '85. So, well, I'm in the position to look back. That goes with the age. So I said, when this building was built, it was this and that, and it was even before the euro, and it was we still had the guilder and that sort of thing. But also that at that time, the Minister of Foreign Affairs was basically the only one looking after the international world.
That's right.
And one of the famous jokes was, why is this such a large ministry? And then the Minister of Foreign Affairs said, well, we are a small country, so we have an awful lot of foreign affairs.
That's right.
which is always a nice...
Yeah.
And I said, well, today the Minister of Foreign Affairs is a bit of a sad position, in the sense that all the important international affairs are being dealt with through all the other ministries. And when there's really big things to do, it's the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
So, but he's still in charge of the international network of diplomats.
Yeah.
And that's where I was trying to point at, because I said, well, the by far most important subject today clearly is the Ukraine war. And every single ministry is now, let's say, joining the group of well, I would almost say warmongers who are promoting to push even harder. And he's the only one who is, in the end, responsible for a whole network of diplomats who would try to, in my view, would need to look after some diplomatic solution here and a ceasefire under whatever circumstances. And that should be his focus as the very last person standing, so to speak, in the entire government. And, well, that was the basis of my speech, which I had worked hard on, and, well, we discussed it. But then I was interrupted by some stupid questions where everyone seems to be 100% sure that NATO and the West is only about good things.
Yeah, of course.
And they are the good guys. And Russia is, objectively speaking, the bad guy. So how on earth can I defend their position? I said, well, I'm not defending any position. I think we should all agree that this is very dangerous. One of the points I made was, we've been very reluctant to be, let's say, rough with Kim Jong-un. Because, well, you know, he had two or three nuclear missiles and all that, so you never know. And now we have the largest nuclear power on earth, and we are pushing like crazy, as if there's no tomorrow. I mean, where the hell do we get... So that was the basis of my discussion. And then I had to explain to them that since '91, the Soviet Union has been dissolved, and there's several republics that are unstable in terms of borders and all that. And I had the impression that and there comes the fatherly feeling again, that these people in the chambers were hardly aware of that and have no idea.
That what you've just said reminds me of something, a short exchange I had with the head of the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, where I gave a lecture many years ago. And I asked him only one question. I said, what does the Soviet Union mean to your students, who of course were 20? And he replied to me, absolutely nothing. So if it's ancient history for Russians, then of course it's ancient history for Western Europeans who never even had whose families never had the direct experience of it. No, I mean, you made that point very well, and you said that diplomacy needs to be engaged, and it isn't being engaged. And I thought that was obviously a very important point, particularly from the point of view of the Netherlands. We talked about this on the phone, because the Netherlands as a country has, even before Geneva, The Hague was the home of international law. The Dutch administrative capital is the home to the Peace Palace. It's where the very first international peace conference was held in 1899, the Second Hague Conference in 1907. And the Netherlands at that stage profiled itself as the seat and ultimately, perhaps not the guarantor, but certainly the seat of international law as it had been established before the First World War.
So I put that in front of the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the second round of the discussion. and he said yes, it was paid for by Carnegie. He had clearly looked it up. So yes, but it was so clear that at this very point we were dealing with a ruthless dictator, and the atrocities are all over the place. And well, he was simply reiterating the whole thing, and saying that. So also he was. I said it's like I'm talking about with a minister of war.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet Carnegie and all those jurists and so on who sat around the table in The Hague in 1899, then in 1907, they were progressives. And as you just said, the progressives today are in favor of war. We've seen Ursula von der Leyen, for example, leading the pack and saying we must have war because if there is peace, then it will mean a defeat for Ukraine.
Yeah, so we are being, well, and then, of course, in a debate like that, they use every angle to try and frame us as a party, as Putin lovers and things like that, which I think I could relatively successfully diffuse, because I keep on saying, let's not talk about the moral preference left or right here. Let's talk about the necessity to stop the bloodshed as soon as possible. So that was one thing. Another subject, which is in the same area, was about the information, the disinformation. So I asked to lift the sanctions on, or the how do you say that?
The censorship.
The censorship on RT in the Netherlands, because my point was, I myself, as a news consumer, so to speak, I want to know both sides in order to judge what's plausible, what's reasonable, where do I... And we only get one side of the propaganda, and the other side might very well be quite a lot of propaganda as well. But you can
weigh
sort
it
of
up, exactly.
And then I got interrupted as well with people saying, the other side is propaganda. I mean, this is the reality.
But it's incredible, really. It's incredible.
Well, it is rather low level in terms of intellectual capacity, because I'm convinced that the people for 90% are serious about that. They mean this.
Yes.
It's not a play.
Of course. And we were saying just before we went on air that in Soviet Russia and in the satellite states of the Warsaw Pact, people were bombarded with state propaganda, but they didn't believe it. They didn't believe it. Everybody joked about it in the Soviet Union and East Germany and everywhere. They joked about it. They said the only thing that's true in the newspaper is the sports results. And yet we have perhaps not, maybe not a similar level, but maybe not the same level, but a pretty high level of propaganda. And yet people in our societies believe it.
Yeah, but I've been skeptical, well, already for over 10 years, but the last few years, I can't even bring myself to watching the regular news, because every single item irritates me, because it's drenched in bullshit, basically.
Exactly.
And that is very annoying. And it's surprising to me, actually, because so my main, my main emotion is surprise rather than anger when I'm in the chambers in Parliament, because almost every single parliamentarian takes all these stories seriously, and they read the papers, which all come from the same source, and they think, I read this paper and that paper, I look at the the news and there, so I got 4 different sources, so I weigh up, but these sources are from the same basic source.
Exactly, because it's a very important point that all media, we saw this, by the way, recently with the scandal over Gideon's alleged remark about occupying Parliament, bezetten. And the one word bezetten was the key to the scandal, and it came from one source and immediately was picked up by 10 or 20 different Dutch media. But in fact, it only had one source, and that source was in fact untrue.
Very good. It's also, let's say, a hopeful point that that all the various media are so extremely focused on what we are doing,
Yes.
and are a bit in disarray when I speak, because I have a different style,
Yes,
and
yes.
it's it comes across as very reasonable.
Yes, exactly.
And then they think, wait a minute, how can that be? How
Yeah.
can this man belong to that group? That something's wrong here.
Yeah.
So that is, I think that's hopeful, but it's also hopeful that they are clearly very much focused on what we're doing, and that can only mean, I think, that they have some idea that this might represent a far wider feeling in the broader feeling in society, and of course we have been the largest party out of nowhere,
Yeah.
and I still have the impression that people are not really 100% sure that it can't happen again,
Yeah,
sort of thing.
yeah, that's very good. Well, that's a good, hopeful note to
I think so.
finish on. I'd love to have you back on the show. I haven't said it yet, but you're a former banker, and you've spoken recently about the FTX scandal, the cryptocurrency scam, shall we say, that has collapsed. I'm not sure whether we should talk about it now, or whether we should save it for another time when we know a bit more about it. Go ahead.
Perhaps a short thing about it. It is quite extraordinary that the boss of this FTX guy, the Friedman guy, who's now somewhere in the Bahamas, I think, he boasted of his relationship with the Ukrainian government.
Yes, indeed. I know.
And the Ukrainian government has, during the wartime, so in the last 2 years, they have actually set up new laws in order to give more room to crypto platforms. And also the Aid to Ukraine program that stimulated donations to the Ukrainians through Bitcoin. So the whole government of the Ukraine has set up an infrastructure to allow this to happen. And well, at least also through that regulation, already had some connections with the crypto world, and more specifically with FTX. And now that FTX has sort of imploded, where there's at least $1 billion is gone. There's rumors that this might also lead back to the US and even the Democratic Party.
Absolutely.
I can't prove that, but it's at least, let's say, a dodgy environment. So what I asked the government to do was to set up an inquiry to see whether this is indeed true, whether this this whitewashing sort of scheme is indeed going on. And until we are sure that that's not the case, to hold the donations from the Dutch government to Ukraine. And then again, I was interrupted. People said, "How do you know that? I mean, this is." I said, "Well, I don't know. I just
you want to know." And are they going to do an inquiry?
No.
Well, there you are then. But we know the truth in that case. Ralf, thank you so much for coming on the Laughland Report. Let's make an appointment for you to come back on again soon.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Goodbye.